Imagine being the genius who discovered the building blocks of life, helped rebuild London from ashes, and uncovered the laws of gravity, only to have your greatest rival literally erase your face from history. It sounds like the plot of a historical thriller, but it is entirely real. This is the story of a deliberate, systematic erasure of one of the most consequential minds in human history. Today, we take a journey into the astonishing, dramatic, and ultimately tragic life of Robert Hooke. Welcome to Legendary Lives Unveiled. If you are fascinated by the dark corners of history, the bitter feuds behind closed doors, and the profound personal tragedies that fueled the modern scientific world, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this video as we resurrect a man deliberately obscured by time, and people called him the Leonardo of England. Looking through modern biographies, the dusty archives of the Royal Society, 17th century architectural logs, and incredibly, a decoded secret diary written in shorthand, the sheer scale of what this man accomplished is just staggering. But our mission is not merely to list his inventions. It is to resurrect a man whose genius was fueled by profound personal tragedy and vicious rivalries. The 17th century was not a polite society of gentlemen simply sharing ideas. It was a vicious, highly competitive arena. To understand the adult Robert Hooke, we must wind the clock back to the boy. A boy whose life was defined by two overwhelming forces: sickness and death. He was born on July 18, 1635, in Freshwater, a small village on the Isle of Wight. His father, John Hooke, was an Anglican priest, a curate at the local church, but Robert was a profoundly sickly, frail child. He was so fragile that his parents genuinely did not expect him to survive childhood. He contracted smallpox early on, a disease with a terrifying mortality rate in the 1600s. He survived it, but it left him permanently scarred and disfigured. On top of that, he suffered from crippling, constant headaches. Every time his father tried to sit him down for a formal classical education, teaching him Latin and Greek to prepare him for the clergy, the intense study would trigger these severe migraines. Eventually, his father simply gave up. The sick boy was largely left to his own devices, wandering around a rural island. Because he could not participate in the normal physical activities of childhood, his mind turned inward, and then outward, to the physical objects around him. He started building incredibly intricate things. Parish records and early biographical notes mention that he once saw a brass clock dismantled. He didn't just look at it. He went home and built a working replica completely out of wood. This was an astonishing feat of reverse engineering for a child. A 17th century brass clock would have relied on a relatively complex escapement mechanism and likely descending weights, rather than a modern coiled steel spring. For a child to understand the gear ratios, how one wheel turning once per hour connects to another turning once per minute, and to carve those precise teeth out of wood so they meshed perfectly without jamming, showed a mind that intuitively grasped physics and geometry before he even had the vocabulary for it. And he didn't stop there. He built a model of a fully rigged warship. It wasn't just a toy boat to push around a pond. It was equipped with a mechanism that allowed tiny cannons to actually fire as it sailed. He was taking the chaotic world around him, a world filled with illness and physical limitation, and rendering it into miniature systems that he completely controlled. But this isolated, inventive sanctuary of a childhood took a massive, traumatic turn. In 1648, when Robert was just 13 years old, his father, John Hooke, died. And he didn't just die of old age or a sudden fever. Records from the Isle of Wight strongly point to the fact that John Hooke committed suicide by hanging himself. The psychological imprint this left cannot be overstated. A 13-year-old boy, already physically frail and deeply aware of his own mortality, when he suddenly loses his father to a violent, self-inflicted act of despair. He was left as an orphan with nothing but 40 pounds to his name. In 1648, 40 pounds was a respectable sum, enough to secure an apprenticeship or sustain him for a few years if he was incredibly frugal. But it wasn't enough to live on indefinitely. He was now entirely responsible for his own survival. This intense early proximity to death shaped his worldview in a fascinating pivot. He didn't retreat into theology or spirituality like his father. He went in the exact opposite direction. He began to view the entire universe as a giant, intricate machine. He couldn't control his failing health, and he certainly couldn't control his father's severe depression. But gears, springs, and levers, he could control those. They follow rigid rules. Apply force A, we get result B. Wood and tension do not lie to you. They don't suddenly decide to stop existing. Mechanics became his sanctuary. When the human world is unpredictable, irrational, and painful, the physical world of cause and effect offers a profound sense of safety. He was learning to master the physical world because the emotional world had failed him so spectacularly. This intense need for mechanical control became the survival mechanism that propelled this 13-year-old orphan out of the quiet Isle of Wight and into the bustling, dirty, chaotic world of 17th century London. He took his 40 pounds and briefly apprenticed with the famous portrait painter, Peter Lely, utilizing his incredible natural talent for drawing. But the fumes from the oil paints and the physical labor of grinding pigments triggered his debilitating migraines again. So, he pivoted. He managed to enroll at the prestigious Westminster School, boarding with the legendary headmaster, Dr. Richard Busby. Dr. Busby was infamous for his severe discipline, but he was also a brilliant educator who recognized raw talent. Under his roof, Hooke's genius exploded. Hooke allegedly mastered the entirety of Euclid's Elements in a single week. To grasp the logical progression of those 13 books of complex mathematical proofs and foundational axioms in just 7 days was a staggering intellectual leap. Dr. Busby recognized that standard classes would only slow the boy down, giving him unsupervised access to his massive personal library to nurture this raw, untrained intellect. By 1653, at age 18, Hooke moved on to Christ Church College at Oxford. This is where the trajectory of modern science changed forever. Oxford, in the 1650s, was the gathering place for a group of natural philosophers who called themselves the Invisible College, the men who would eventually form the Royal Society. Hooke met influential thinkers like John Wilkins, and more importantly, he crossed paths with the wealthy aristocratic chemist Robert Boyle. Robert Boyle is widely considered the first modern chemist. A man of immense wealth, vast estates, and brilliant theoretical ideas about the nature of matter and gases. But Boyle had a significant problem. He was a gentleman philosopher. He lacked the practical, hands-on mechanical skill to actually build the experimental apparatus required to test his hypotheses. He needed an engineer. He hired Hooke as his assistant. And Hooke didn't just assist. He literally built the Machina Boylina, the famous air pump. To understand the magnitude of this machine, you have to understand the philosophical battleground of the 17th century. Since the time of Aristotle, the prevailing scientific dogma was that nature abhors a vacuum. The idea that nothingness could exist in the physical world challenged theological notions of an omnipresent God. Boyle wanted to prove that a vacuum could be artificially created and studied. To do that, you have to fight the crushing pressure of the Earth's atmosphere. Previous attempts by other scientists either imploded spectacularly or their seals just leaked. Hooke had to invent an entirely new, incredibly robust system. He designed a massive, thick glass sphere. Below it, he engineered a brass cylinder fitted with a specialized wooden piston. To solve the leaking problem, he soaked leather in a specific mixture of oil and water, wrapping it tightly around the piston to create an airtight seal that could still move up and down. He essentially created the first heavy-duty industrial vacuum chamber. The physical labor to operate it was exhausting. As the air pressure inside dropped, pulling the piston down required a rack and pinion crank system. Hooke was the one sweating, turning the cranks and sealing the intricate brass valves to make the machine work. Through this machine, they discovered Boyle's law, the inverse relationship between the volume and pressure of a gas. They proved that sound cannot travel in a vacuum, but light can. They showed that a candle extinguishes and an animal suffocates without air, linking combustion and respiration. But the textbook says Boyle's law. It was Boyle's name on the cover of the published findings. While Boyle was generous in his writings, acknowledging Hooke's mechanical assistance, the intellectual credit and the lasting historical name went to the wealthy patron. This dynamic set the template for Hooke's entire career. He became the invisible engine, making the brilliant ideas of others physically possible. In 1662, this Oxford group officially received a royal charter from King Charles II and became the Royal Society of London. Needing someone to run their weekly meetings, they created the position of curator of experiments. Boyle naturally recommended Hooke, but while curator of experiments sounded prestigious, the contract was essentially indentured intellectual servitude. The position was initially entirely unpaid. Hooke was completely dependent on the erratic goodwill and lodgings provided by wealthy patrons, yet contractually obligated to produce 3 to 4 considerable experiments for the society to witness every single week. At a breakneck pace, Hooke invented foundational technologies just to justify his presence in the room. He invented the universal joint, the mechanism still used in the steering column and drive shaft of almost every car on the road. He invented the iris diaphragm to control the aperture in modern camera lenses. He invented the wheel barometer to measure atmospheric pressure and the balance spring for pocket watches, revolutionizing navigation and timekeeping. This relentless output highlighted a fundamental, the agonizing tension in Hooke's life, the strict class divide of the 17th century. The Royal Society was composed almost entirely of wealthy, aristocratic gentlemen philosophers, men with powdered wigs, family money, country estates, and titles. They did not have to work for a living. And then there was Hooke, the son of a poor deceased curate with zero inherited wealth. He was a mechanic who had to earn his bread through his physical labor. This fundamental difference made Hooke deeply, obsessively protective of his intellectual property. His ideas and inventions were his only currency. He possessed the theoretical brilliance of the gentleman, but the social standing of a laborer. Imagine the scene. Aristocratic dabblers sitting in plush velvet chairs, debating high-minded philosophy. While scurrying around the edges of the room is Robert Hooke, pale, lean, his spine increasingly deformed from childhood illness and hours hunched over workbenches, getting his hands covered in oil and soot to prove their theories. He was the hired help, treated with subtle condescension, yet objectively the smartest man in the room. But Hooke would not stay in the shadows of the aristocrats forever. Because in 1665, Hooke published a book that fundamentally shattered how humanity viewed reality itself. He published Micrographia. Micrographia was an absolute turning point in human consciousness. Hooke took the compound microscope, an instrument that had been around for a few decades, but was largely considered a novelty, and turned it into a serious scientific tool. Early microscopes were notoriously blurry, suffering terribly from spherical and chromatic aberration. The glass lenses distorted the light, creating fuzzy, rainbow-colored halos around everything. Hooke vastly improved the lens grinding, but his real stroke of genius was the illumination system. Because if you magnify an object 50 times, you are also magnifying the darkness. You need intense light. Hooke invented a system using an oil lamp, focusing its light through a water-filled glass globe. This globe acted as a condenser lens, casting a brilliant, concentrated beam of light directly onto his specimens. With this intense, clear light, he pointed his microscope at the everyday world. He looked at insects, sponges, bird feathers, the edge of a razor blade, the tip of a needle, and snow crystals, soon utilizing the innate artistic skills he honed during his brief stint as a painter's apprentice. He drew what he saw with meticulous, breathtaking precision. The visual impact of this book in 1665 cannot be overstated. Take the famous drawing of the flea. This wasn't just a small sketch in the margin. It was a massive fold-out page. Imagine the vertigo you would feel in that moment. You've lived your whole life thinking a flea is just a speck of black dust that makes your dog itch, a mere nuisance. And then you unfold this page, and you see a creature that looks like an armored alien monster. It was covered in spikes, intricate scales, and complex jointed legs, rendered with horrifying, beautiful precision. It completely shattered the public's understanding of scale, where proving undeniably that an entire universe existed right under their noses. An invisible ecosystem, living in their clothes, on their skin, and in their food. It was in Micrographia that Hooke looked at a thin slice of cork. He observed that the plant tissue was made up of tiny, rectangular, porous structures. They reminded him of the small, unadorned rooms that monks lived in within monasteries. Rooms called cells. So, Hooke coined the biological term cell. Every time a modern high school biology student talks about cell division or a medical report details cellular regeneration, they are using Robert Hooke's word. But Micrographia was not just a coffee table book of scary bugs. Hooke hid some incredibly dangerous revolutionary theories within the text. While examining microscopic fossils, specifically fossilized shells found far inland or on mountaintops, he tackled a major scientific and theological dilemma. The accepted belief of the time was that these rock formations were sports of nature. They were thought to be just rocks that, by sheer coincidence or the influence of the stars, happened to look like shells. Because admitting they were real sea creatures found on a mountaintop would mean admitting the Earth's surface had changed dramatically, which conflicted directly with the literal biblical timeline of creation. Hooke examined the microscopic structure of petrified wood and compared it to regular wood, and then did the exact same with the fossilized shells. He deduced they were undeniably the actual remains of ancient, once-living creatures whose organic matter had slowly been replaced by minerals over vast stretches of time. Furthermore, he noted that some of the fossilized creatures he observed, like certain ammonites, didn't seem to exist anywhere on Earth anymore. He casually proposed the concept of biological extinction in deep-time geology, centuries before Charles Darwin or Charles Lyell. He argued that the Earth's surface had been radically transformed by earthquakes, floods, and geological processes over unimaginable periods of time. And he also waded into theoretical physics. In Micrographia, He proposed that heat is not a physical substance or a fluid, which was the prevailing caloric theory of the time. Hooke argued that heat is a property of a body arising from the rapid vibration of its microscopic parts. He was anticipating the kinetic theory of heat and thermodynamics. He also suggested a new wave theory of light. He compared the propagation of light to the way ripples spread out across the surface of a pond when you drop a stone into it. This directly contradicted the theory that light was made of physical particles, a theory that a young, unknown mathematician named Isaac Newton was currently developing. Micrographia was a masterpiece. Samuel Pepys, the famous diarist of the era, bought a copy and stayed up until 2 a.m. reading it, calling it the most ingenious book he had ever read. Hooke was suddenly famous, a public intellectual. But just as he succeeded in revealing this hidden microscopic world, he was abruptly called upon to completely redesign the visible, macroscopic world. Because in September 1666, and the greatest catastrophe in London's history occurred, the Great Fire of London. It started in a bakery on Pudding Lane and rapidly devoured the tightly packed, timber-framed city. 5/6 of the walled city was reduced to ash. Over 13,000 houses, 87 parish churches, and St. Paul's Cathedral were completely destroyed. Architectural logs and diaries tell us that Hooke stood on the roof of Gresham College, where he lived and worked as a professor of geometry, and watched the city burn. He didn't flee to the countryside. He watched the mechanics of the fire. While the embers were literally still smoking in the streets, he was drafting a master plan to rebuild the city. He presented this vision to the Royal Society and the king just a week after the fire was extinguished. Hooke proposed wiping away the chaotic or disease-ridden medieval street layout, the twisted little alleys that allowed the fire to spread so quickly, and replacing it with a rational grid of wide, straight boulevards. It looked very much like modern-day Manhattan, but urban historians point out that Hooke's plan was strangely anti-capitalist. While other architects who submitted plans, like John Evelyn, centered their new cities around the Royal Exchange, the banks, and the trade guilds, Hooke's grid marginalized the commercial centers. Instead, he placed the parish churches at the most prominent central intersections of his grand boulevards. Why would a hyper-rational scientist design a city entirely around churches? It speaks to his background as the son of a clergyman, but it also suggests a deep philosophical viewpoint. Trade, greed, and the chaotic accumulation of wealth had literally burned the city down. To Hooke, true order, safety, and morality were intertwined with divine geometry. Unfortunately for Hooke's vision, King Charles II rejected the grid plans. It wasn't because the king didn't like them, but because the legal and financial logistics were impossible. The crown simply didn't have the money to buy out every single surviving landowner, flatten the ruins, and redraw the property lines from scratch. People fiercely clung to the exact footprint of where their house used to stand, even if it was just a pile of ash. They had to rebuild the city on its old, twisted, medieval street plan. But Hooke's brilliance wasn't ignored. The City of London appointed him as a city surveyor to work alongside the king's appointee, his friend Christopher Wren. When history always gives Christopher Wren all the credit for rebuilding London. You hear about Wren's St. Paul's Cathedral and Wren's churches, but the historical logs make it explicitly clear Hooke and Wren effectively rebuilt the city together. Wren was the visionary, the aristocratic architect who schmoozed with the king. Hooke was the guy in the mud, holding the measuring tape, doing the brutal math. He was the indefatigable engine on the ground. Bureaucratic records show he processed up to 90 complex property boundary disputes a month. The traumatized citizens were ruined, fighting over every inch of charred rubble, arguing over where a wall stood or a tavern extended. Armed with his surveyor's precision, his newly invented surveying instruments, and his deep understanding of human mechanics, Hooke mediated these vicious squabbles. So he staked out the foundations, ensured the new brick buildings met strict fire codes, and redesigned the infrastructure. He paved the streets and canalized the open sewers, like the infamous Fleet River, turning it into a structured underground channel to improve public health. But he wasn't just a mediator and a civil engineer. He was a brilliant architect in his own right. He designed the Royal College of Physicians, featuring an incredible octagonal anatomical theater. He designed the sprawling new Bethlehem Royal Hospital for the insane, known as Bedlam. And here, his dark, dramatic flair came out. He commissioned terrifying, imposing statues for the entrance gates, depicting raving mania and melancholy mania. They were incredibly stark, muscular, anguished figures meant to serve as a warning and a testament to the chaos of the human mind. It was a chaos Hooke constantly feared within himself and his own family. Perhaps most famously, he designed the monument to the Great Fire. The monument perfectly encapsulates the mind of Robert Hooke. If you visit London today, you see a massive, beautiful fluted Doric column near London Bridge, topped with a gilded urn of fire. To the public, it is a memorial, but Hooke secretly designed it to be a colossal piece of scientific equipment. He built a skyscraper to act as a secret laboratory. The central shaft of the 202-foot column was built completely hollow, aligning perfectly with an underground observation chamber beneath the street level. The entire building was designed as a zenith telescope. Hooke wanted to lie in the underground chamber, open a hatch at the very top of the column, and look straight up at the stars to measure stellar parallax and definitively prove that the Earth orbits the Sun. To measure the visual shift of a star, similar to how your thumb appears to jump back and forth when you close one eye and then the other. Over the millions of miles the Earth travels between June and December, you need an incredibly long, perfectly stable telescope, hence the massive stone monument. He also wanted to use the height to conduct experiments on gravity and barometric pressure. He wanted to use the entire city as his personal laboratory, but it failed. The logs note that when Hooke finally tried to take his astronomical measurements, the lenses shook violently. The vibrations from heavy horse-drawn carts rumbling over the cobblestone streets around London Bridge transferred right into the bedrock and up the stone column. His measurements were completely ruined. His ambition outpaced the technology of his time. He was designing 20th century physics experiments with 17th century materials. Yet, the sheer audacity to convince the City of London to fund a giant hidden telescope disguised as a public memorial shows the immense force of his intellect. Yet, while he was bringing order to the streets of London and accumulating wealth, his personal life, behind the closed doors of Gresham College, was descending into a chaotic, deeply taboo, psychological thriller. Hooke's obsession with control and his deep-seated paranoia mutated into something incredibly dark within his own home. He kept a meticulous diary from 1672 to 1680, chronicling his daily life, coffeehouse meetings, and digestive issues. But he wrote the most sensitive, private parts in a complex shorthand, heavily utilizing astrological symbols to hide his meaning. When historians cracked this code in the 20th century, they found a man consumed by intense jealousy, paranoia, and a scandalous domestic entanglement. The tragedy started with his family. In the 1670s, his older brother, John Hooke, a grocer and the mayor of Newport on the Isle of Wight, began spiraling out of control. John was caught using false weights in his shop, literally cheating his customers. Publicly disgraced, he lost his position and borrowed massive amounts of money from Robert to cover his mounting debts. Then, in February 1678, John Hooke committed suicide by hanging himself. Not exactly like their father. Caught directly in the middle of this devastating manifestation of generational trauma was John's daughter, Robert's niece, Grace Hooke. Because of financial struggles, John had sent Grace to live with her uncle Robert in London when she was just 10 years old. Robert became her guardian, primary provider, and teacher. But as Grace grew into a young woman, the dynamic shifted in a way that was highly scandalous, even by 17th century standards. The diary reveals Hooke became obsessively, extremely jealous of any men who paid attention to her. When Sir Thomas Bloodworth, the wealthy son of the former Lord Mayor of London, wanted to marry her, Hooke actively sabotaged the relationship. Then, an incredibly powerful man, the governor of the Isle of Wight, Sir Robert Holmes, started courting her. The timeline cross-referenced between the diary and Isle of Wight medical records suggests a grim sequence of events. Grace went back to the island for a visit and became involved with Sir Robert Holmes. Shortly after, her disgraced father committed suicide. Financial records show a local physician, Dr. Harrison, was paid a significant sum for the diet and board of Grace during a period of seclusion, strongly implying she was pregnant with Governor Holmes's illegitimate child, a girl named Mary. Traumatized by her father's violent suicide and the scandalous pregnancy, Grace was rushed back to London to live in seclusion with her Uncle Hooke. And it is here the relationship crossed a definitive, disturbing line. Using the astrological symbol for Pisces, the diary records that Hooke, a man now in his 40s, began a sexual relationship with his teenage niece. He exploited his power dynamic as her protector, her only family left, and the controller of all her finances. His paranoia spiraled entirely out of control. He was sleeping with his live-in servants, like a woman named Nell Young, using her almost as a domestic informant to spy on Grace's movements and moods. He became convinced that everyone, his scientific colleagues at the Royal Society, his servants, and even Grace herself, was conspiring against him to steal his ideas and his wealth. He literally wrote in his secret diary, "Grace a spy." The cognitive dissonance here is staggering. This is the man who formulated Hooke's law of elasticity. Ut tensio, sic vis. As the extension, so the force. It is the exact mathematical relationship between stress and strain. Now, if you pull a spring twice as hard, it stretches twice as far. It is a law of absolute, rigid, predictable physical order. But his personal life was an uncontrollable, catastrophic mess of incest, domestic surveillance, betrayal, and this dark, inherited family trauma of suicide. The tragic irony of his life was that the man who tried to map the universe onto a rational, predictable grid was drowning in irrational human emotion. And this intense, almost pathological paranoia about theft, the fear that people were constantly stealing his ideas, was not just confined to his diary. It was about to spill over onto the world stage and ignite the most bitter, consequential scientific rivalry in human history. Which brings us to the ultimate clash. Robert Hooke versus Isaac Newton. To understand why this rivalry became so incredibly toxic, you have to understand that these two men were absolute opposites in every conceivable way. Hooke was older, deeply embedded in the noisy, collaborative, coffeehouse culture of London society. He was an experimentalist, a man who built things with his dirt-stained hands, and someone who published a wide spray of brilliant, if sometimes mathematically incomplete, ideas. Newton, on the other hand, was a solitary, deeply introverted, fiercely hierarchical, almost mystical mathematician. He lived an isolated monastic life in Cambridge. He didn't build physical models. He calculated the underlying truth of the universe on paper. And crucially, Newton demanded absolute mathematical perfection before he would publish a single word. The bad blood between them started early, long before gravity. It started over optics. Hooke had already published his wave theory of light in Micrographia. Then, in 1672, this young, unknown Cambridge fellow named Isaac Newton submitted a paper to the Royal Society claiming that light is not a wave, but is made of tiny physical particles. He called them corpuscles. Hooke, acting as the senior resident expert, essentially wrote a condescending review of it. He publicly stated that Newton's experiments with prisms were nice, but his particle theory was entirely wrong and, frankly, derivative of Hooke's own work. Newton's reaction to this criticism was atomic. He possessed a famously fragile ego and a terrifyingly vindictive streak. He wrote a savage, highly detailed rebuttal, publicly humiliating Hooke. It was during this ongoing, a multi-year feud over the nature of light, that Newton wrote a letter to Hooke, containing one of the most famous quotes in the history of human thought. "If I have seen further, it is by standing on the shoulders of giants." Today, we hear that quote used as a beautiful, humble sentiment, printed on inspirational posters in science classrooms to represent collaborative effort. But when you look at the historical context of their letters, historians suspect it was actually a vicious, calculated insult. You have to remember Hooke's physical appearance. He was severely afflicted with kyphosis, a pronounced worsening curvature of the spine that made him look remarkably small, crooked, and hunched over. Many modern scholars interpret Newton's line not as humility, but as a cruel, mocking dig at Hooke's physical deformity. He was essentially saying to Hooke, "I am able to see further because I build on the work of intellectual giants, not a little crooked man like you." It was breathtakingly petty. But the optics fight was just the warm-up. The main event, the war that would define their legacies, was over gravity. In 1679, Hooke was acting as the secretary of the Royal Society. Trying to act like the bigger man, he attempted to coax a deeply withdrawn Newton back into scientific correspondence. In a fateful letter, Hooke explicitly laid out a radical new hypothesis for planetary motion. Up until this point, people didn't really understand why the planets moved in ellipses around the sun. Hooke wrote to Newton and suggested that the orbit of a planet is a constant physical balance between two competing forces. First, there is a straight-line inertial motion, the planet naturally wanting to fly off into deep space in a straight line. Second, there is an inward, attractive force pulling it continuously toward the sun. Crucially, Hooke proposed the exact nature of this pull. He suggested that this gravitational force decreases by the square of the distance between the two bodies. The inverse square law. Think of a can of spray paint. If you hold the can 1 inch away from a wall and spray, you get a small, intensely dark circle of paint. If you pull the can 2 inches away, twice the distance, the paint spreads out. It doesn't just cover twice the area, it covers 4 times the area, and the paint is only 1/4 as thick. Pull it 3 times as far away, it covers 9 times the area, and is 1/9 as thick. The force weakens by the square of the distance. Hooke intuited that gravity acts exactly the same way through the vacuum of space. Hooke wrote the exact conceptual mechanism of gravity in a letter to Newton in 1679. He literally handed him the blueprint of the universe. He provided the brilliant conceptual physics, but Hooke, the mechanic, the intuitive experimentalist, did not have the advanced, cutting-edge mathematical ability to prove that an inverse square force would definitively result in an elliptical orbit. Newton, the supreme mathematician, read this letter, realized Hooke was onto something profound, and went completely silent. He ghosted him for years. Newton retreated to his study. He invented entirely new branches of mathematics, calculus, and did the excruciatingly complex nor tedious calculations required to prove the geometry of the solar system. And then, in 1687, Newton published the Philosophia Naturalis Principia Mathematica, arguably the most important scientific book ever written. He mathematically proved the universal law of gravitation, and he refused to give Robert Hooke any credit whatsoever. When Hooke saw the published Principia, he was apoplectic. He demanded that Newton publicly acknowledge in the text that Hooke had supplied the initial notion of the inverse square law back in 1679. But did Hooke actually deserve the primary credit? Having a brilliant hunch, even a correct one, isn't the same as proving it. Anyone can say gravity weakens over distance like spray paint, but Newton spent years doing the grueling mathematical work to prove it was a universal law. It is the ultimate philosophical debate in the history of science. Who is the true discoverer? The man who intuits the physical reality, or the man who provides the rigorous mathematical proof? The 18th century French mathematician Alexis Clairaut summarized this exact feud perfectly when he wrote that Hooke's example shows what a distance there is between a truth that is glimpsed and a truth that is demonstrated. Hooke had the brilliant physical intuition, but Newton built the unbreakable mathematical architecture that made it an undeniable law of nature. Still, Newton could have added one sentence in the preface, a polite nod to their correspondence. Edmund Halley, the astronomer who discovered Halley's Comet, and who was personally paying to publish the Principia, begged Newton to just give Hooke a minor acknowledgement to keep the peace. But Newton was enraged that Hooke dared to question his supreme originality. Newton threatened to suppress the entire third book of the Principia, rather than share a shred of credit. He systematically went through his manuscript and maliciously deleted almost every single reference to Hooke. He decided to obliterate his rival. And that deliberate obliteration leads us to the tragic final act of Hooke's life. In 1687, the exact same year Newton published his masterpiece and ascended to scientific godhood, Hooke's niece, Grace, suddenly died at the age of 27. The blow to Hooke was absolute. His friend and first biographer, Richard Waller, noted that Hooke was inconsolable. Waller wrote that Hooke grew less active, more melancholy, and cynical. He lived for another 16 years, but the fire, the relentless drive that rebuilt London and mapped the microscopic world, was gone. He died on March 3rd, 1703, at the age of 67. The descriptions of his final days are grim. He was blind, bedridden, his body swollen, his spine bent almost double. And in a detail that feels almost Dickensian, upon his death, they found a massive iron chest in his room at Gresham College. They pried it open and found 8,000 pounds in gold, coin, and money. It was a fortune. He had hoarded his salary from surveying the city for decades. He died an incredibly wealthy man, but utterly alone, leaving no will. But the tragedy did not end with his physical death, because just months later, Isaac Newton was elected president of the Royal Society. And Newton had a very, very long memory. In 1710, so Newton oversaw the Royal Society, moving its headquarters from Gresham College to a new building at Crane Court. During this move, the official portrait of Robert Hooke, the only authenticated painting of him from his lifetime, mysteriously vanished. Out of all the delicate scientific instruments, all the thousands of books, all the portraits of the various fellows, only Robert Hooke's portrait was lost in the move. It has never been seen again. The legend immediately sprang up that Newton personally destroyed it, or ordered a servant to throw it in the fire, to literally erase his rival's face from the halls of history. Modern historians, like Alan Chapman, often point out that there is no smoking gun, no written order from Newton saying, "Burn the Hooke painting." But the circumstantial evidence is overwhelming. Newton had the motive. He had the opportunity as president overseeing the move, and he had a heavily documented history of vindictive, obsessive behavior toward anyone who crossed him. But there is a massive modern twist to this detective story. A few years ago, a biologist from Texas A&M named Larry Griffin put forward a stunning theory. Griffin suggests that a painting by the 17th century artist Mary Beale, currently hanging in an obscure collection and known only by the generic title Portrait of a Mathematician, is actually the missing, erased portrait of Robert Hooke. The forensic analysis Griffin applied to this painting is absolutely fascinating. He points out a series of incredibly specific, overlapping clues. First, the physical description of the sitter matches contemporary accounts of Hooke perfectly. Striking gray eyes, wavy brown hair, and notably lacking the aristocratic powdered periwig that a gentleman like Newton would wear. Furthermore, the sitter is wearing a heavy, voluminous mantle that appears strategically draped to hide a severe curvature of the spine. But the real, undeniable evidence is on the table next to the sitter. The man in the painting is pointing a finger directly at an architectural-looking drawing on the desk. When Griffin digitally enhanced and analyzed the geometry of that specific drawing, he found it perfectly matched an unpublished 1685 manuscript drawn by Robert Hooke. And what was that manuscript? It was a geometric proof showing that a constant central force produces an elliptical orbit. It is the exact gravitational geometry he fought with Newton over. Furthermore, sitting on the table is a partial view of a brass mechanism. It is an orrery, a mechanical clockwork model of the solar system. The first official orrery wasn't supposedly built until decades later by Thomas Tompion. But Tompion was a clockmaker who collaborated closely with Robert Hooke. This strongly implies the painting shows Hooke's unrecorded original prototype. And if you look through the window in the background of the painting, the landscape shows a very specific building. It perfectly matches Laidler Castle and the Church of St. Michael in Cumbria. And who was the architect commissioned to redesign those exact buildings? Robert Hooke. It is simply too specific to be a coincidence. The exact drawing of the elliptical orbit, the prototype mechanical solar system, the specific architectural commission in the background. It's him. It has to be him. And it explains exactly why Isaac Newton wouldn't want it hanging in the new Royal Society headquarters. The painting is literally Robert Hooke visually taking credit for the physics of planetary orbits. Newton must have taken one look at that painting during the move and said, "Absolutely not. Lose it." If Griffin's forensic analysis is correct, then Hooke's face actually survived Newton's purge. It was just hidden in plain sight, misidentified, waiting 3 centuries for someone to look closely enough to see the clues he left behind. Which brings us to the ultimate question of his legacy. We live in a world fundamentally built by Robert Hooke. When you drive your car, the universal joint steering your wheels is Hooke's invention. When you look through a microscope at a biological cell, you are using his word. When you look at the intricate springs of a mechanical watch, that is his design. The modern grid of cities, the foundational understanding of deep geological time and extinction. He touched all of it. Yet for centuries, he was the invisible man of the scientific revolution. It raises an uncomfortable truth about how we remember the past. History does not always belong to the genius who has the initial idea, or the brilliant mechanic who builds the first prototype. History belongs to the person who writes the final, undeniable equation. And perhaps more importantly, the person who survives the longest to control the narrative. As you go about your day, adjusting the steering wheel of your car, checking the time on your watch, or looking up at the stars, think about that sick 13-year-old boy on the Isle of Wight. He's staring at the intricate brass gears of a clock. Did he really figure out the fundamental laws of the universe? Or was he just a terrified kid, desperately trying to build a machine that couldn't break his heart? If you found this exploration into the hidden corners of scientific history as mind-blowing as we did, make sure to like, subscribe, and share this audio with a friend who loves a good historical mystery. We are Legendary Lives Unveiled, and we will catch you next time.